might have already.
Oh, you're fine. I'm going to let people get in here for a second. Little pre-show action for anybody that caught the link as it popped up, and we will have a full link here in just a second, depending on when it pops up. So if you folks are in queue, if you're starting to watch, there's nobody there yet. So, well, let's see.
Yeah, I'm seeing myself live.
Hey, that's awesome. Oh, the Big Ten Conference Day. There it is. Okay, it's definitely live. So we got nobody on yet. So we're going to wait a second until people actually get going.
You're underselling this. It's got to be like a club. It's like, man, like it's jammed in here. Like if you want to get in, like we're opening up the VIP room.
I'm not recording, and no one's ever going to see this part except for the people that find the video on YouTube, and that's fine. Hold on. A second here.
All right. Well, we just crashed our first server, so we're hoping to get our second one up and running. It's like that spot in the social network. It's just things are crashing and everyone's going on. And what's this face match? I want in.
All right. Let me hit the tweet and good to go. Okay. Here we go. Let's make this happen. Oh, Blaska says there's 30 people on already. So apparently my counter's wrong. Hi, everybody. We're going to get the podcast started. Hold on one second.
I told you. VIP room. Blaska. Invite. Get the Cristal. Okay. Open the ropes.
They're going live in 5, 4, 3, 2.
You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to CrimsonCast. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield on that side of me. I forget, we're reversed here. But hey, good to see you all. We had to bust out the live equipment as some seismic stuff happening with the Big Ten Conference. And you know what, Scott? This is one of those days that I think we thought might be coming. We weren't sure. We were getting concerned. A lot of stuff had happened that was, if you're a Big Ten fan, was reasonable to be concerned about. And yet here we are as we head into the new academic business year, which I think actually plays a part in all of this. And the Big Ten has taken over Los Angeles. Like it's a fascinating thing that's happened. We're going to talk about all of it. We're going to take your questions and comments. You can post questions and comments a couple different ways. If you want them to show up graphically on the show, go to the YouTube channel, which is just my YouTube channel. You can just search Galen Clavio on YouTube and you can find it there. If you're listening to this afterwards, it's cool. We love you and we're happy that you're joining us at any point. But for those of you joining us live, I'm Galen. This is Scott. This is CrimsonCast, and we are part of the Back Home Network, brought to you by Home Field Apparel. Be sure to check out Home Field Apparel, who sells shirts for every team that we're going to talk about on this podcast, including USC and UCLA. You can use the code HOME, HOME, for 15% off your first purchase. So, Scott, first of all, we weren't expecting the podcast today. And in fact, it kind of felt like we were in our doldrums period, like for summer. Like there's a little bit going on with IU basketball. IU football signed a kicker today, which is always big news. But about 1:00 this afternoon, this weird tweet pops up, and it's like, well, USC and UCLA are considering maybe joining the Big Ten. And I'm looking at this, and I'm like, I'm exchanging some DMs with like Stu Jackson, who lives out in LA, and Hank Glassner, and we're like, is this for real? Is this like a trial balloon? Are they trying to fake people out to get better media rights for the Pac-12? And then within 6 hours, not only has it been confirmed, but the Big Ten commissioners and presidents have already voted them in. It's like the biggest sneak attack that we've seen in college sports in a while, bigger than Texas and Oklahoma, because that one played out over a little bit longer period. Yeah. This one, out of the blue, no leaks, nothing. And now suddenly we have USC and UCLA in the Big Ten, not something anybody would have thought about potentially happening over the course of the college sports like time period. So I guess let's get your reactions. We haven't talked about this at all. We exchanged one text message. Your initial reaction was what?
Well, first off, so I will, it's CrimsonCast at dark, so I'm doing Upland wheat in my Knicks glass. Or I guess we should say this is CrimsonCast like afternoon, because it's happy hour in LA. It's only 6:30 there.
That's right.
So I was out golfing with some friends, and yeah, we saw the text coming in. I have a text chain with some friends where we're always kind of busting chops, and it's like they're talking about it. It's like I don't know if those are not reliable sources, but I'm like, is this for real? And then like between holes, I'm kind of checking it, and then I'm just like, I gotta talk to it's like I gotta talk to Galen, because like if this is real, I kind of texted you like, hey man, this is real. We should podcast. You're like, yes, it's real. We're podcasting. My feeling is this, and I've been pretty up about this. I'm stealing your point. Like you had a podcast about realignment, I think a year ago about this time, and you were talking about kind of the idea of, the Big Ten needs to be more aggressive than passive in this. And you kind of went through all the iterations of things that could happen. I latched onto that, and anybody that I've talked to since then, I've been very proactive in this, that like, look, we're at war with the SEC. And it felt like my fear was the Big Ten was going to be passive. And that's what I didn't like about the kind of super secret, like, hey, we're going to play more games of the Pac-12 and more games of the ACC. Just kind of like, hey, we're going to have a kind of a gentleman's agreement. It's like, we're not playing the gentleman's game here. Like the SEC is trying to take over the landscape. So I've been saying for a while, they should grab the Pac-12 and just rip the heart out. They did it, although it sounds like USC and UCLA came to the Big Ten, but who knows how it happened. But and it's funny. I will also say this: after golf, we went to drinks with some friends, and one of them was asking, like, why do you think? Because I'm saying I'm going to podcast. I'm like, why do you think this is happening? And I don't know who gets the attribution for this quote. Tony Kornheiser uses it all the time on PTI, but the answer to all of your questions is money. Like in the end, that's what it comes down to. But no, at a high level, I think this is great. I have a list of questions here for you. I want to know who we're going after next. Like I got a wish list. This is like, it's like, I love the NBA. It's like free agency for the NBA. Now it's like, all right, like who can the Pacers get? Are we going to get, DeAndre Ayton? It's like, if you're the Big Ten, it's like, all right, who are we going to go for? We go for Arizona. We go for Florida State. Like who's on the chopping block? Who can we get? So no, I think this is great. We can dig into it, why I believe that, but I think this is, we're kind of in a grow or die situation. And I will stop at that. I have a lot of other thoughts to talk about, but at a very high level, I'm thrilled. I think it's really good for the Big Ten. My only thought too is I feel bad for Cal, who's like, UCLA, like I thought we had something here. Like we're state schools. Like, come on, man, aren't we friends anymore? Like
we're actually part of the same university. Like we're just different branch campuses. Yeah, no, there's a lot.
USC, like that whore, that girl, like you're leaving with her.
Yeah, no, it's something else. I mean, let's back up a little bit and talk about how we got here. And I think this is informative. And if you listened, for those of you who have. If you managed to get the first podcast I did today in before listening to this one, we need to talk. I need to send you a T-shirt or something like that.
You're better than me because I haven't done it yet.
The point that I think is important to make is you see a lot of people complaining right now about the move. You see a lot of people complaining about what they would perceive as this not being college sports. And there's a lot of focus on, well, this doesn't make sense from a geographical perspective. It doesn't make sense from a rivalry perspective. It's not good for athletes in these various schools because now they have all this travel. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I've seen a lot of people complaining about, well, gosh, now we got to have like USC versus Rutgers as a conference game. I mean, first of all, I get where you're coming from, and I don't want to undermine that from a perceptional standpoint. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the era of college sports that you are thinking about is more nostalgia right now than reality. And this is nothing that the Big Ten started. I mean, some people would argue that this goes back to like 1991 with Penn State joining the Big Ten. But even that was a reaction to moves that had happened in the previous decade that were changing the financial and structural realities of college sports. And so what we're seeing at this point is essentially 30 or 40 years worth of changes culminating in the spot that we're in right now. Where this really got started, the current era, was actually about 2003. And that was when the ACC cut the heart out of the Big East and raided Miami and Virginia Tech, and really changed the dynamics of college sports at that point, because what they did was essentially they made it about football, and they made it a situation where you had to grow into either better brands, better media markets, better reach from a media perspective, or you were going to be relegated to obscurity. And so since 2003, for literally 20 years now, we've seen moves and counter moves, and we've seen the aggressive conferences survive and put themselves in better positions. What you're also seeing in this situation is brands like USC, especially USC, more so than UCLA, being in a position where you're shackled to a conference that is dragging your national profile down. And this is exactly what happened with Texas in the Big 12. I mean, Texas has itself to blame for that to a large degree. Texas demanded a huge share of media rights. They demanded all of these different things. And then what occurred was they essentially weakened everybody else in the conference so much that it made the Big 12 not a possibility anymore. It's ironic because the Big 12 nearly lost Texas to the Pac-10 when the Pac-10 was trying to expand back in 2010, 2011. So you almost saw all of this be a completely different thing. There's a real sliding doors situation that exists with all of this. But what ends up happening is that USC, who, not 15 years ago was the preeminent team in college football, has watched their profile, their reputation get dragged down further and further every year because of how inept the Pac-12 and its leadership, frankly, have been in not just their competitive aspects, but their media rights negotiations and how they've reacted to the changing landscape of college sports. And so I understand the concerns about this not feeling like, the college sports that a lot of people grew up with, but it's the direction that things are going. And if you're a Big Ten fan, if you're an Indiana fan, I think this is something you have to really be supportive of in the long term. You can be a little sore about it and say, this doesn't match my vision of what things should be. But the way things are, this is about the best possible scenario that the Big Ten could have asked for, given the landscape and where it is right now. So I think about it, and I say to myself, it's actually a win-win. It's a win for the Big Ten because it puts them in the second largest media market in the country, and they now own that market. Like, there's no other relevant teams in the Los Angeles marketplace, and those teams are going to be playing Big Ten teams every week. And it's a win for the LA schools because, you travel be damned, frankly. Like, there's a direct flight, as Matt Blaska put it in our text thread. There's a direct flight from East Brunswick to Los Angeles. Like, you can get very easily from Newark to LA. Like, the travel is not that big of a deal. You're right now, if you're an LA school, you're flying to Oregon, you're flying to Washington, you're not busing to Boulder, Colorado. Like, this was already happening. Is there a big difference between a 2-hour flight and a 4-hour or 5-hour flight? I don't particularly think so in the big scheme of things. So it's a win-win for both sides. And I think ultimately what we have to think about moving forward is, where does this leave us as the next move? Because there's almost certainly going to be a next move, probably several next moves. How all this unfolds is going to be really fascinating to watch. So what other questions do you have? I guess I want to get to the audience questions too, but you come first, Scott.
Thank you. Before I get to the questions, I will say this to people. You mentioned, people who may not like this or doesn't feel like, the way they think of college athletics. I would say this, that it's happening. So you kind of have to just understand it's a new reality. But I've been saying this for a while, but today's a perfect day to use this kind of counterfactual. Imagine if the news today was different. Imagine if the news was, hey, Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State are all going to the Pac-12. That could have, just imagine that as a reality. Now, as an Indiana fan, which everybody I'm assuming 90% of the people on the podcast are, it's like we're kind of up the creek without a paddle, so to speak. Like, that's not a good spot. Like, you're Kansas has a much better basketball program than we do, and they're kind of stuck in the ether and kind of like, where are we going to go? And
Kansas is staring down the barrel of being UConn. I mean, I apologize to our UConn friends, but it's like Kansas at this point might as well just join the Big East and make football go independent. Like, yes.
No, sorry. And just, we're not a football power. That's a different podcast we can get to, but we're not the SEC. It's like, we can't just be like, we're going to the SEC. Like, we're lucky to be in the Big Ten. We need to be in the conference that's growing. And that was my biggest fear, was that by standing still, you were letting the possibility of either the SEC or the Big East or like some other conference is going to say, all right, we're going to rip the heart out of the Big Ten, or they're going to do it now. And now we're in a spot where it's like, okay, it's pretty obvious. It's the SEC it's the Big Ten. Like, those are the two big dogs. And good news, we have a seat at the table. We are there. We're one of the so that's the counterfactual I would just say to everybody is, how would you feel if 3 or 4 of the biggest teams in the Big Ten went to the Pac-12 right now today? Suddenly we'd be having a much more despondent podcast where it's like, okay, but I mean, we could have Houston and we could play with, Louisville. Like, you could get this kind of weird Conference USA. So that's the other way to look at it. Where Indiana sits, we need to be in the conference that's aggressive, not the one that's being poached.
It's like the old thing, it's like if a bear is chasing your group of friends, you don't have to be the fastest. You just have to be faster than the slowest. And in this case, I mean, the SEC might have some competitive advantages still in football. I think they probably do. I mean, they've got the most talent-rich states in football are in the SEC. But you're doing a lot better than the ACC and the Big 12 right now if you're the Big Ten. And I do think that that's important as we move forward.
Let me get to my question. So
please, go ahead.
I was going to say, one thought, though, is like in the Big Ten has had the very cool kind of Game of Thrones type intro of all the schools. It's going to be funny now when they do like USC, UCLA, and then just 25 seconds going across the country, and then we'll get to Nebraska. But
they already do. Yeah, they already do it because they already started with the Rose Bowl graphic. It starts in LA, so it's great. All they have to do is drop the logos of those schools, and they don't have to change a thing about that commercial. It's tremendous.
I have 3 questions, so I want to get to my 3.
Okay.
So first one, what do you see as the next moves? And who else is on your wish list as a Big Ten fan if the Big Ten is going to go after somebody?
So I think to some degree, that's going to depend on a couple of factors. And this is something I may actually say, let's time out and let's wait until the end of the podcast to talk about, because I think right now the chessboard moves are going to depend on a couple of factors that largely have to do with what makes the most sense financially. And the thing is, the financial picture is very open. And I think it's informative for the audience to first start off and talk about what the financial picture really looks like and why this move even happened in the first place from that perspective. So for those of you who don't keep up with these things, money has gotten to a level in the last 15 to 20 years of college sports where it is far beyond what most people think it is. Yes. I mean, it's on a different level. It's on a professional sports level. And I'm not just flippantly saying that. Like, what we're seeing, we were already, before this news, there was talk in the industry about the Big Ten being able to sign the first $1 billion plus television deal going into this next cycle, which is supposed to turn over in 2024. What that means,
this helps make that number higher.
It does. Well, that's the point.
Yeah.
And so, the point is this, that right now, Big Ten schools bring in about $40 million a year, maybe slightly more than that, in television revenue alone. And what that's allowed all the schools in the conference to do is have a surplus of money compared to most of the other schools that they're competing with outside of the Big Ten. For a while, the Big Ten was tracking ahead of the SEC. Now they're kind of in the same boat, but we're seeing this trajectory with Big Ten money where right now it's a $40 million to about $20 million difference with a Big Ten school versus an ACC school. So the ACC's contract, which goes through 2036, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, only guarantees each ACC school about $20 million a year. Big Ten, currently at $40 million a year, if they get this new deal, it's going to be about $100 million a year per school just off of television rights. That doesn't count ticket revenue. It doesn't count merchandise. It doesn't count donations. The SEC is in the same stratum where they're earning about $100 million a year, or they will with the projected new television deals now that they've jumped off the CBS contract. The Pac-12 last year only distributed about $20 million per school off of their television revenue. That is unsustainable if you want to be a major conference. And the problem is the ACC, the Big 12, and the Pac-12 are essentially all in the same boat. And the spread that you're seeing from a financial perspective with the two big conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC, it's going to essentially be almost two completely different sports. Are you in that top echelon versus are you in that secondary echelon? This news, as you mentioned, suddenly makes the Big Ten television contract that much more attractive, because now you've added the Los Angeles market, you've added Southern California, and that's worth a lot in terms of advertising revenue, in terms of different eyeballs, in terms of an entirely new national fan base and alumni base, which both USC and UCLA have. UCLA because of graduates, USC more because of reputation and the fact that they've been one of the stalwart brands in college football for so long. Go ahead.
I just want to jump in real quick. Like, I think it also allows you, as you go into these negotiations, if you're the Big Ten, everyone was so freaked out. It's like SEC has all these big schools, which they do. But the reason I was saying we should do something like this and that I like it is that for two reasons. One, you have the top three media markets in New York, Chicago, and LA are now all under your purview in the Big Ten. But I do think now the Big Ten can go to any of these media companies, ESPN, NBC, ABC, Amazon, Apple TV, whatever, be like, I mean, kind of flippantly, but, hey, the SEC's cute. That's a regional area. Like, you now have the SEC locked in, and it's like, we are the national college brand. We go time zone to time zone. We can schedule from noon to 10 p.m. And, this is your world, but I do understand that also, like, the media companies look at this as content. Like, they want brands and content, and can you fill time? And now you can fill all the time zones, and depending on where they go with it, like, you now can kind of landlock the SEC, where it's like, that's cute, that's really fun for the Eastern time zone, but we are the national college sports brand. And I do think it allows the Big Ten much more flexibility in how they promote and talk about themselves. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're right, because I mean, we've already seen, there was a tweet by John Oran from Sports Business Journal earlier tonight where he says, well, now that USC and UCLA are in the Big Ten, Apple has come back and said, hey, Big Ten, we'd really like to be part of the negotiations for this new media contract. I mean, you add inventory, you add a big market, and now suddenly you've created a scenario where you are a national brand truly from a college athletics perspective. And this is an advantage that the Big Ten will have in the inevitable Big Ten versus SEC showdown, in that, yes, the SEC has a lot of national brands. Alabama, national brand. Georgia rapidly growing into a national brand. Texas is a national brand, but they're ultimately still schools where most of their alums are regional. Most of their focus is regional. And, the majority of their schools have regional fan bases. They just happen to be very, very good at a sport that a lot of people care about. Now, what's interesting to me is the Big Ten still has to get over the competitive imbalance that they still have in football, but this helps to chip away at the idea that a national advertiser is just going to automatically gravitate towards the SEC. Because, as you said, if you can deliver the New York market, the Chicago market, the Los Angeles market, and a bunch of big alumni bases that are in a bunch of different markets around the country, that is going to be attractive. You've got three of the four time zones covered. You've got the three most populous time zones covered. So you've got a lot of things going for you. And I think ultimately that's where, that's why I want to wait on talking about next steps a little bit, because you've got a good thing right now. And it's like, well, do you go ahead and make your next move, or do you wait to checkmate whatever the SEC tries to do next? That's going to be the big question mark. And I've got some thoughts on that.
My other two questions are, they're both, I'll say them now, but let's save them for the end. My other questions are, who does the SEC go after based on this? My other question too is I got to give it to my friend Robert. We were talking, he brought this up to me. What happens to the Rose Bowl? Like, the Rose Bowl was already kind of on shaky ground a little bit, but it's like this kind of kills the Rose Bowl. And the idea, it would be funny if next year it's USC in the Rose Bowl, and it's kind of like, oh, it's already a pre-Big Ten, all Big Ten Rose Bowl. And I'll just finish with my last thought that if this does mean it's the end of the Rose Bowl as we know it, if the Pac-12 is kind of like, all right, man, we're done screwing with you in the Big Ten, it does solidify what I've been saying for years, is that, Indiana did have 70, 80 years to do it, but it's like, by the time we get back to the Rose Bowl won't be the Rose Bowl anymore. Like, we're going to get there, and it's like, oh, it's not really what it used to be. There's not a parade. It's like, we had our shot. But anyway, so those are my two questions, but they are kind of focused in that same, like, what happens next. So maybe some of the listener questions can get us over the hump till we get to that very ending spot. So let's go.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do think it's very interesting, because ultimately what you've got is the Rose Bowl has stood in the way of so much in terms of college football, whether it's a college football playoff, a college football championship game, That's always been used as the thing that's not allowing those things to happen. I mean, even down to we can't change the day of the playoff game because the Rose Bowl has to be played at this particular time in the afternoon because they want the sunset. It is kind of funny that it's essentially in the process of being junked because the two local schools, including one that plays in the Rose Bowl for its home games, are piecing out of the Pac-12. But no, overall, I'll just be happy for IU to be in the Rose Bowl, even if it's just a meaningless, like late September regular season Big Ten game. I'm great with that. I will go to that game. I will pay premium prices for tickets. I'm totally down with it. Anyway, let's get to some of the questions that folks have because we're going to wind our way through some of those. Some of them were asked earlier on Twitter, and then we're going to talk about some of the future implications of things. A lot of people in the comments right now. I really do appreciate you folks joining us. A couple here, Jennifer saying that escalated quickly. It really did. And one of the things I mentioned on Twitter, I think the most shocking thing to me about all of this was how quiet it was. I mean, to go from no one said a word, and then in 5 hours they had been accepted, and there were, fully graphically outlined tweets with statements from presidents and athletic directors in both conferences.
Because normally the way this goes is like today would be the day where it floats out, and then everyone's kind of like, what? And then like by tomorrow or Saturday, it's like they rush together a press conference like, oh yeah, this might be happening. It's like, you're right. Like within 3 hours, like this was not leaked. This has obviously been discussions. This was going to happen. And you're right. It's amazing that they didn't seem to be caught off guard. It seemed like they were ready to go at 5 o'clock today to get it done. It's clear.
And look, I do think the timing thing is fascinating. And my friend Zach Singer, who was on the podcast with me earlier that you all should listen to, brought up a great point that I hadn't thought of before, which I mentioned at the beginning, which is today's the last day of the academic calendar from a business perspective. Academic calendars from a financial perspective go July 1st to June 30th. And so they essentially waited. Now, this was not thought of and consummated in a day. And whether this was something that started cooking back in November, December, whether this was something that started cooking around the time Lincoln Riley got hired, whether this was something that got cooked up during COSIDA, which was last week, whatever it was, there was a lot of advanced planning in terms of the timing. Because by doing it now, you basically set yourself up so that those two schools can leave in a couple of years, can join the Big Ten, and you can put everything in motion. You can get contracts signed or changed or do whatever you need. And it only essentially affects 2 business cycles from this point forward, rather than all those contracts being signed and moved forward.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing too, is how soon. It's like 2024. It's like you started thinking like, oh, that's like 2 seasons. Like that's like very, very soon.
Yeah, but I mean, it's going to be an awkward next couple of years for almost every conference in college sports, because you're going to have Texas and Oklahoma who are on their way out of the Big 12. You've got all these schools coming out of the American or out of Conference USA that are going to the Big 12. And it's just like, wow, there's going to be a lot of unhappy meetings of schools as you see people leaving and coming. It's going to be really fascinating.
I will say, if you're like Kevin Warren, this is the time you can call up Tom Allen and be like, you'd be like, hey, remember when you took the Big Ten logo off your jersey? Like, hey, I'm not effing around. Like, do you want to take that back? Like, can I get an apology card? Because we're making deals here. Like, there's things are happening quickly.
I will say, and look, we talked about realignment on the podcast around the Texas-Oklahoma news, and we were pretty critical of Kevin Warren and the Big Ten in general for a lack of action. And, we talked about on that podcast this idea that the Big Ten needs to go big or go home. They need to make a play for the Los Angeles schools. And it didn't seem like it was happening. It seemed like the Big Ten was like, well, I guess we'll take Kansas because they're available. And they didn't do that. They really did. And whether you believe the reports that have been put out there that it was the 2 LA schools that approached the Big Ten and said, we'd really like to come. And the Big Ten was like, well, we're not going to turn that down. Or whether it was actually, negotiated a lot more behind the scenes. I think Warren deserves a lot of credit for keeping it quiet, making it happen, and putting the conference in a much better position from a business perspective than it was 24 hours ago. So all is forgiven, Commissioner Warren, I guess. But
the last thing I'll say to that is like, it's just, you have to give him credit. Who knows how it started? Again, like, I don't think USC, UCLA reach out unless they feel like you're going to have reciprocation there. But you just have to give credit with just how smooth you had a 2-hour cycle where it's like, hey, it's happening, and like, hey, it happened, versus you're right, the Oklahoma SEC thing, Oklahoma, Texas to the SEC took a couple days. It was kind of dirty, and people like it got kind of contentious, and it was very good that you saw. It's like it's almost too quick to even be contentious. It's like, oh, it already happened. Like nobody even has to. Now people are just trying to figure out what's going on. So yeah.
Yeah. So a couple of things we wanted to get to. Adam Cabe posted, and we're not intentionally competing with our brethren in the Back Home Network, but Assembly Call is doing Assembly Call Radio live tonight because it is Thursday. But no, I mean, it's a big news night, and I think there's plenty of audience to go around. But Ryan Phillips, who, of course, is a big USC guy and has not taken the news well, I would say, at least from reading his Twitter feed today. So Adam says, Ryan on the Assembly Call podcast a moment ago says he expects that since football is the driving force behind these moves, it's likely that in 5 to 8 years, the top football teams all bail and leave schools like IU behind. Do you guys share that theory? Example, superpower conference for football, possibly separate from the NCAA entirely. Here's the thing. I mean, that it certainly is possible that could occur, but I think the one thing to keep in mind is that college is weird. College athletics, the way that universities interact with each other is very strange. And in some cases, you're right. Like UCLA and USC are looking around and saying, well, football is the most important thing. We're going to leave. I don't at this point. I think 5 to 8 years is probably too short term of a time period. I don't see a situation where you're just going to see all of the top football schools leave and go somewhere else. And here's why. Top football schools love money and they hate losing. And having 120 FBS schools filtering all of the money is too many. But having 20 might not be enough because you do need a geographical spread. You do need a spread of ability and talent and functioning capacity in terms of some of these programs. And so, if you stick, let's say you had a conference that was just the top 10 schools. Like, let's just hypothetically say you had Oklahoma, Texas, USC, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Florida State, and Miami, or whoever. You had those 10 schools in a conference. You know who's not going to be happy? The team that finishes with the losing record in that conference, which is going to be half of them because they all have to play each other every year. You're always going to have some cannon fodder. I mean, even the NFL has 32 teams, and some of them suck every year, like the Lions. Some of them are, good most years, but you're going to have that flexibility. And I think that ultimately most of these schools realize that, and they realize that, you're not going to be able to survive just having the strong play the strong. The Premier League in England's a great example of this. Like, yes, you've got your top 6 or 7, but that's not enough. You have to have 20 teams, and some of those teams are going to have to be naturally worse than the other teams. So I think as long as you're in the Big Ten or the SEC, they're not going to ask you to leave because there's a lot of contractual stuff that has been tied up in the creation, not just of those conferences, but of their television deals that make it very difficult to remove somebody. I mean, what was the last school that was kicked out of a conference? There haven't been many of those instances that have happened over the course of time because there's ultimately a solid base that you can have to work with in every conference. And sometimes that means you're going to have, it's why Vanderbilt's in the SEC. It's why Northwestern and Indiana have been in the Big Ten. It's why Duke, at least in football, is in the ACC. There is an understanding ultimately that you're going to have a top to bottom that isn't necessarily all top because that pushes some of the top to the bottom if you do. I hope that makes some sense. So I don't share that theory. I understand where Ryan's coming from. And who knows? We'll check back in 10 years and he might be right and I will apologize if that's the case. But I don't see that organizational thing occurring at this stage.
I agree with a lot of what you said. I will say this, that I think we're barreling toward, 2 20-team I think the Big Ten and the SEC will be 2 20-team conferences. And when you look at kind of who is already in there and who might be pulled in, you're going to kind of have that already with, that's going to be, 40 teams that are kind of the creme already. I would also say, as you mentioned earlier about the money thing, I'll just use Indiana as our example. Like we're in the right spot. We're going to be getting that money. And so if you even just say over the next 8 to 10 years, just on the fact that we're going to have an extra $30 million a year versus like Utah, we're just going to get better because we're going to have better facilities, better NIL. Like we're just going to be better than the teams that are left behind. And so in 8 to 10 years, there may not be teams that are better than Indiana just based on the fact that we've had way more resources than they have. And so we're part of that cream rising anyway. And I agree with you. Like, it's not just the schools, the coaches. Like, coaches love to have winning seasons. That's a lot of the reason why there's so many bowls. Coaches love to talk about, I went to a bowl. Like, Ohio State, they don't want to go, like you said, they don't want to go 5-7. Their coach sure as hell doesn't want to do that. And so you have to have some teams you'll beat up on. But I think, but yes, so I agree with a lot of what you said. We've been an institutional member. I feel safe. The team that kind of the one school that I look at that won the ultimate game of musical chairs is Rutgers. It's like they came in at the perfect time in the perfect spot, and it's like they probably won't get kicked out. They probably don't deserve to be there, but they're the ones where it's like they won the musical seat lottery in this game.
I was talking about this with Matt Zimmerman earlier. It's either Rutgers or Mizzou. Like, I think those are your two options. Mizzou got to join the SEC, and that's not a school you think about when you think about Southeastern Conference. And then Rutgers, obviously, I think Maryland might be the better choice because Maryland not only got into the Big Ten, but got to wipe like $40 million of debt off of their books by joining the Big Ten. And now the rest of the ACC is looking around being like, wait, Maryland's making literally double the amount of money that we're making. So Nathan asks, and this actually ties in with something that you just said, what's the new revenue from the TV deal going to be able to do for IU specifically, athletics? Would it be improved facilities? Where would that go? So I think it's important to keep in mind the revenue growth. IU in 2005 had an athletics budget that was a little shy of $50 million. I think it was about that. Right now, IU's athletic budget, I think, is about 115, 120 million. I might be a little bit off. I'm not sure what COVID did, but that, you've already seen essentially an increase of more than double of what Indiana was making. And that was under the current television deals. IU making $100 million a year strictly off of television revenue, of media rights. I mean,
big heads in the entire stadium, not just in the big heads on the. Everybody gets a big head.
I mean, the interesting thing about IU, I think it really helps on the coaching front and the NIL front, because ultimately it does two things. On the NIL front, it keeps IU relevant, playing relevant schools, and maybe it gets alums, particularly on the football side, more excited about giving money to a program that, yes, is downtrodden, relatively speaking, is the losingest program in college football historically, but there's a lot of growth there. And you're going to have...
It's such a great system where we're talking about how they're getting so much money from the TV deal, but we're also talking about how they need to get boosters to give them money. It's a great deal.
Well, here's the thing, and this isn't a direct NIL thing because the money isn't going to NIL, but what it does do is it allows IU to improve its facilities by adding boutique sorts of things that can attract donors who can then be turned around and put into NIL collectives or be convinced to provide money to athletes that want to potentially come to IU. I do think that that's a very important thing. Straight up facilities, I mean, look, IU's facilities are actually pretty good, all things considered. Like, obviously, IU needs a new practice facility for football. It does. I mean, that's an unavoidable reality, and that has to get done. And I would hope that that's the first thing that the new money comes in and provides. But, if you look around, you've got a brand new baseball stadium, you've got a brand new softball stadium, you've got a renovated soccer stadium, you've got a renovated basketball stadium, you have a practice facility for basketball, you have a twice renovated football facility. You've kind of maxed out. I mean, if you wanted to look at, okay, do we finally build a brand new basketball arena? Maybe that's the next step. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 10 years.
I hear you, Galen, loud and clear. $100 million marketing budget. You bring back the Bison. You just
there you go.
Blow it out, gold horns. Let's bring back $30 million. I'm bringing back the Bison.
I love that idea. But no, I think really where this really helps is in coaching, because you're going to have to pay top dollar to get coaches, and this allows you to do that without having to dip into different types of funds. It gives you a lot of flexibility there that you wouldn't have before, and it puts you ahead of a bunch of other schools that are currently ahead of you. We talked. I went back and listened to our postseason podcast for football, and we talked about how like the offensive coordinator for Western Kentucky went to Texas Tech because that's a better, more attractive school to go coach football at. Well, now if you're IU, you have the ability to say, well, okay, yes, you've got perhaps better athletes there, but we've got an extra $1 million sitting here if you'd like to come coach at IU instead. And I do think that ultimately is going to be a big factor. This is one of those things where the money is like so stupid that it's almost hard to know what you would spend it on. It's like winning the lottery. It's like, well, hey, I'm going to buy a car and a house, and hey, I've still got $97 million left. Now what do I do? And this is where you end up, in a gutter in Vegas, like 6 years later, having lost everything. I don't think it's going to happen.
So in 2 years, we're going to have 2 practice facilities. Just like, we got 2 practice facilities, and one's got a pool. And
my point is more, it's hard to think about what you do at this point with the amount of money, because you're essentially more than doubling the media revenue that you've got coming in. And look, athletic departments, their job is to spend money. They're not meant to be profit centers. They're meant to be essentially revenue neutral or running a slight deficit so that everybody can claim that everybody loses money in college sports. But that's ultimately, it's a game changer for IU.
This is where that gap should happen, where it's like every assistant coach IU should be able to outpay for any assistant versus any school that isn't a Big Ten or an SEC school moving forward. Yeah. So if it's like, Kansas is looking to hire a new offensive coordinator, IU should be able to come in, over the top style and just be like, hey, we can throw an extra 500,000 on there. Let's go. Like they're going to be the wild guy at Vegas just throwing money around. Or they should be like that. That's where I'm going to be frustrated if IU suddenly continues to be like, well, we gotta pinch our pennies. It's like, no, like you said, you won the lottery, start throwing money.
And again, compared to the rest of the Big Ten, compared to the SEC, IU is probably going to struggle in sports like football.
I'm saying, but everybody else,
you're in better shape then, and you would much rather be in that position. I'd like to thank Matt Blaska because he did point out a school that got kicked out of a major conference, and that, of course, was Temple. And it's interesting because Temple got kicked out because of poor attendance and failing to meet financial obligations, neither of which really IU's in any trouble of doing. I mean, right. IU's football attendance is pretty good. Yes, it's much lower than most of the other schools in the conference, but for the size of the stadium, it's pretty good. And you compare it to a lot of other schools in NCAA football right now, you're doing okay.
And again, just be ahead of, like, you don't have to be the slowest. You're ahead of Rutgers. You're ahead of Northwestern. Like you're ahead of them in those categories. Yeah.
Let's go back. Let's ask some other questions. So Tyler Keys asks, USC and UCLA have to now ask for a couple more Western schools, right? Scheduling just seems tough to figure out. We're going to tackle this a little bit more later. I do think it's interesting because in football, and even in like men's and women's basketball, I don't think this is that big of a deal. Yes, it's a long flight, but I mean, again, I just flew literally 2 days ago from Los Angeles back to Indianapolis. My secret mission was successful. You're welcome, Big Ten. I got both of them.
You got it done. Well done getting it done. Yeah.
I did that flight from LA to Indianapolis. It's 3 hours and 55 minutes in the air. That's not that bad. And so I don't think that's a big issue. I am really interested to see what happens with the non-revenue sports, the Olympic sports, and the way that those schedule. Now,
that's what I said. It's like I feel bad for like the water polo teams where it's like, hey, you're going Rutgers to UCLA, back to Rutgers to Nebraska, back to Rutgers. Like,
water polo does that already. Indiana is not in the Big Ten. Indiana is in a conference that's full of California schools in water polo. So that it's a great point, but it's like it's the one example that doesn't work. But like and even something like baseball. As Zach mentioned on the previous podcast, guess what? Instead of having to go and play like series in Florida and Louisiana in February, the Big Ten can just send all of their schools to Los Angeles and play series in February. They might have that kind of figured out because now they've got a warm weather spot where they can reliably go play some games. So that's nice. But it is going to be interesting as we move forward how some of the non-revenue sports interact. It's great for some of the non-revenue leagues. I mean, the Big Ten being able to add UCLA to men's soccer. My God, that's tremendous. That's an awesome thing to see. Obviously for baseball, it's a big effect, and there's several other sports that get impacted as well. Now, Tyler's question about, do we see more Western schools? That is something that's going to be interesting because I do wonder, like, you can fly out of LA easily, and if you're flying to like Illinois or you're flying to Iowa, it's not that much different than right now flying to Pullman or Corvallis. In fact, it might be a little bit simpler in the case of Illinois because you're flying into Chicago, I think, probably directly rather than flying into some random regional airport. But I do think that some West Coast Conference schools or some Pac-12 conference schools are still in play at this point. It's just going to depend on what move the Big Ten wants to make. And so we'll come back to that in just a second. A couple other comments that I wanted to get to question-wise. Scrolling through here. We had another
lose, like Indiana was always the southernmost school in the Big Ten. We lose that, so it's RIP.
Ryan Madden, best soccer conference in the country. Yes. Now Matt asked a question: how dumb do these leagues look for not accepting the playoff? Top 6 conference winners were autos, with top 4 having buys. Now, no way how that happens. And I do think that that's a really interesting point. Like the move that was afoot to try and expand the playoff ultimately got blocked. And what's fascinating is, yes, the Big Ten was part of the block, along with the Pac-12 and the ACC. And it's a great example. And again, we don't know how this exactly happened. Did the Big Ten, did they shank the Pac-12 in the back on purpose? Or was this one of those opportunity things where it's like, well, we hate burning our business partner who's been running with us for 100+ years, but we just had to do what we had to do. I'd love to at some point hear the unvarnished story of what all happened with that. But it is interesting to think about. If that gets accepted, it becomes a lot less necessary for USC and UCLA to say, hey, we're going to leave. Now, maybe not entirely unnecessary, but all the measures that could have been taken to try to equal out the television money, make it distribute a little bit more evenly, were opposed at various times by the conferences that are now in the biggest danger of not existing anymore. And I do think that that's going to be fascinating to watch as further moves get made. Because right now, if I'm the Big Ten, I'm looking at this and I'm like, yeah, really, that expansion thing, that wasn't a great idea. Like, what if the playoff just ended up being us and the SEC, sending our best team? And maybe the playoff is like the best 2 teams from each conference playing each other for the right to play in the title game. That becomes a lot more attractive. And now it's like, well, why stop at 16 if you're either conference? Because if that's the game, now you put yourself in a position where you're almost running 2 separate professional leagues that happen to have a championship game between the winners of each. It's almost like how baseball essentially is pre-interconference play or pre-interleague play, where it's like you have the American League, which I guess in this case would be the SEC. You have the National League, which is the Big Ten, and the winner plays in the World Series. That's the kind of thing you might see happening as we move forward, and that'll be interesting to see if that's how it ultimately unfolds.
Yeah, the football thing never, the part about it that never made sense is you had, at the time of the BCS, or when it started getting figured out, it's like you had the Pac-12, the Big Ten, the SEC, the Big 12, and the ACC. 5 conferences decide to have 4 schools in the final game. And it's like, you guys realize you set up a situation where one of you is not in it every year, possibly 2 of you, because the SEC is really good. Like, there's not been a lot of thought to this process by the conferences from the whole get-go. Because if I was in that room, I'd be like, hey, there's 5 of us here. Let's make it a 6-team playoff. Like, why are we automatically jobbing one of us? But it's interesting how it's something you said. This is kind of what happens when there's not a principal. The NCAA has kind of abdicated its throne. It's like when there's not a principal in the room, there's not a teacher in the room. The students are kind of at some point are like, hey, why are we doing let's figure out a plan that works for us. This is kind of what's happened is the schools and the conference kind of be like, hey, and it's like, it's funny because nowhere has I heard anybody where it's like, what is the NCAA saying about this? It's like, they're not saying anything because they know they can't do anything.
Well, and ultimately, I mean, if this is a football driven thing, and as we've talked about many times on this podcast, football is not governed by the NCAA. It's governed by the conferences. Now, what's interesting here is there's internecine conflict between the conferences over this, but ultimately what you're getting out of it is a new world order of college sports. And it also will include other sports besides just football. And so, it's a really fascinating thing to watch. I mean, the NCAA couldn't have done a whole lot because they were never going to be able to insert themselves between the schools and their money when it came to football. And that's really what's driving the television contracts. But it does make you wonder, like, if college sports had ever just said to themselves, you know what, we need a czar, we need someone who's in charge of things, who can cut through the crap and can set a chart a course that's like in the best interest of the sport. Maybe we're in a different world than we are now. But look, this is not, again, if you read, there's a great book called The Club, which is about the formation of the English Premier League. And there's a lot of parallels in terms of a group of rich owners gets together and says, why are we subjecting ourselves to the rules of a body that doesn't really understand the business model of the 21st century that we're rapidly approaching? This was in the early 1990s. And that's essentially what's happening with college sports, where these two conferences have decided that they're tired of letting other people hold the steering wheel. It's like, it's time to grab the steering wheel and steer it in the direction. And it's been interesting watching the chess moves, but at the end of the day, the SEC and the Big Ten, while they're in competition with each other, they're kind of helping each other out, because I think they both realize that they are ultimately going to be the last people standing. And as long as they're both standing, they're fine with that. And that's going to be the interesting thing. Some other comments here that I wanted to get to. So Adam, who's been a quote machine in the comments here, in terms of recruiting, this is from Mick Cronin, the UCLA basketball coach. In terms of recruiting, UCLA is a worldwide brand, and joining the Big Ten, which now is a coast-to-coast powerhouse, could make us more attractive to recruits in the Midwest and East Coast. It follows up with, does this actually pull recruits from the Midwest out to UCLA, though? I feel like no. I think in basketball, probably not. And it's interesting because, I think those recruits, if they were going to go to UCLA, were going to go anyway. Like, I just don't know if elite recruits are that locked in geographically in most cases. I think they're going to go where they feel comfortable. It does make it so that your brand is more visible, so that might have some impact. Now, the response that Patrick had on this that I think is interesting, it's basketball's kind of national recruiting if you're UCLA, but for football, it could pull recruits out of the Midwest and make them think about going to UCLA or USC. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because one of the big problems that you have if you're a UCLA or a USC is that your talent pool is kind of thin in California. Like, there's a lot of good players, but there's not a lot of great players, and we're seeing participation levels recede so that the great players that are in the LA area aren't necessarily staying at USC and UCLA, and there's not a lot of natural recruiting grounds outside of that. Now you plug yourself into Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan, and now you're in places where football really still matters. Maybe not as much, and maybe not at the high enough levels as, say, a Florida or a Louisiana or a South Carolina, but you're now recruiting in more fertile ground, and I do think that could have a positive impact. So it ends up being kind of a win-win overall for both sides, because it allows you to keep more recruits in the Big Ten footprint, theoretically, if you're the Big Ten, and it allows you, if you're USC and UCLA, to recruit that, and you probably would have not done that before because it would have been worth your time.
I look at it from the other perspective for Big Ten schools. Is I listened to a pod a couple months ago on Ryan Russillo's show, just talking about the Lincoln Riley hiring, and basically that, he was going to go back to the Pete Carroll days. And I know it's a little bit different, but when Pete Carroll was there, his thing to the recruiters was like, if you're getting on a plane, you're doing it wrong. Like, Southern California is where we're going to recruit. And for the most part, they focus like within a 40-mile radius. And, I would push back a little bit. There's a lot of elite level talent in that Southern California area if you get it right. And it does feel like Lincoln Riley is going to turn around USC very quickly. And what it might do is might help plug some of us Midwest schools into some of that talent there, where we can pull a little bit out of that. So I think, to your point, it could be a win-win, but I look at it from the reverse of maybe we could get some inroads into, the Southern California area, where it's like, hey, I know the weather's 75 all the time, and but if you're thinking long term, man, home values are great in Indiana. I know it's cold. It's not. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, Patrick was on the same boat with you. Yeah. I don't know how many Indiana. I mean, we've gotten some great folks out of California that have come to Indiana.
Richard Mandeville. Let's go.
I mean, really?
He was Indiana. Was he California player of the year?
He was a California guy, but that's the guy that you pulled, Richard Mandeville? Not Joe Hillman, not Dean Garrett. You went with Richard Mandeville? I mean, my God, man. Anyway, Nate Sudfeld is a California guy.
That's fair point.
I mean, geez, Richard Mandeville. I've gotten red-faced over this, Scott. This is crazy. Anyway, Anyway, let's dive into the thing that everybody's been asking about. We had a question earlier on.
Well, we got to say, like, this is obviously because they canceled the Crossroad Classic. Like, now the Crossroad Classic is out. We can now play the UCLA USC games. Like, the Crossroad Classic was holding all of this up.
Right. And now Purdue's playing like Akron or somebody. Who are they?
They're doing the Indiana. They do like some kind of Indiana Classic where they're trying to get it going. And it's like, it didn't work. I've been in that for 10 years. Like 95. I know Purdue fans hate this, but it's like 85% of the crowd was IU fans. Like, sorry, you guys are like, you've been a better program for 20 years. I'm not going to deny it. You don't have a fan base. I'm like, sorry, you don't.
It's true. It's always been true. It's the dirty secret that they don't want you to know about. Anyway, Jennifer asks, what happens to Notre Dame? Tyler throws up Oregon, Washington, Notre Dame, North Carolina. There were a couple of others that we had in the chat that threw, so like Matt asked, what are the big brands left? Notre Dame, Oregon, Clemson, Florida State, Miami. This is what everybody's talking about.
One joke real quick before we get there for real. Just an absolute baller. Like this is pro wrestling move. Again, just for fun. It's like Kevin Warren's like, hey, we're announcing we got Texas.
Right.
They changed their mind. Like, we're bringing them to the Big Ten. Like, that would be like, you talk about a seismic blow. It's like Texas and Oklahoma. We're getting our West, like, we're getting them to the Big Ten. Anyway,
I think that ship has sailed, but I think it is funny that you say that because it's fascinating to think about. No, but I mean, the big question that everybody's been asking is,
who do we go for and who does the SEC go for?
What's next? What's next for the Big Ten? What's next for the SEC? I mean, there was a tweet about the Big Ten may not be done. And I forget who it was that tweeted that out. But
I just saw somebody say too, again, this is now like, you got to know it's real or not, but somebody said like all other Pac-10 schools have said like no one else is leaving. Now, who knows if that's real or not.
Right.
But I've seen that a couple places too.
Yeah. So, it's going to be one of those interesting things because yes, I'm sure all the Pac-12 schools are like, well, of course not. We would never leave. We're locked in. And then that's what, what was, I forget. It was, I think it was Virginia Tech that went like, they got all indignant because Miami was going to leave the Big East and go to the ACC. They're like, well, we were, how dishonorable, da. And then the ACC, it was like, well, hey, Virginia Tech, we'd like to invite you too. And then like 2 days later, they were like, well, we're going to join the ACC. I mean, there's no honor in any of this. Yeah. It's just about jockeying for position and trying.
No, it's like we would never do that. It's like, wait, the check says what?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
How many zeros? Like, oh, it's got a comma. Wait, a comma and the zeros. We're in. Yes.
It's all about, can you drive up the value that you're bringing? And so there's a few interesting directions that this could go. And I do not know what the answer is. I think it's going to be interesting.
Where you fly? Where's your next vacation?
Yeah, that's right. Well, South Bend sounds lovely this time of year. No,
we can do Galen Flight Watch. Like, Galen's on Southwest at Phoenix.
Right.
Like,
that's right.
Tail number SW Southwest. Tail number 1047.
I'm on the Kevin Warren revenge tour. That's no, but so like Iraq TV says, I know that football is the moneymaker, but basketball is the second biggest. Go get UNC and Duke as the ACC falls apart and dominates the basketball market. There was a tweet or a message we just got from Ryan Madden. The AC schools would be great, but they're pretty locked into that TV contract for another decade plus. Now, here's the things that I think are important. And I was debating about this with Zach Osterman earlier, who we'll probably have on sometime this weekend to talk about this because Zach's very well versed in all these things. There's two competing theories right now about what you should do in college sports. Theory A, and this I'd say is probably the predominant theory, and probably, if I'm being honest, the one that most college administrators are going to adhere to, which is we're not going to add schools unless they add significant financial value. This was always why Kansas was a red herring in terms of Big Ten expansion, because Kansas added literally nothing that the Big Ten didn't already have and would have taken money off the table because you would have had to have split the pie more for a team that wouldn't have brought any extra revenue in, or very little extra revenue in. As much as people like basketball, I like basketball too. It just doesn't move the needle as much. The ratings aren't there compared to football, and that really is ultimately what drives so much of the revenue that comes out of this. But there's an alternate theory, which is that the money is going to be there. Like when the original Big Ten expansion happened, I'm not talking about the Penn State one, but when they brought in Nebraska, Rutgers, and Maryland in like that 4-year span or whatever it was, 3 years. The Big Ten was generating, I think at that point, about $10 to $15 million per year in television revenue, which was a decent amount of money. I mean, it was among the top in the country at that point. Then the next round of negotiations happened, and suddenly the Big Ten's bringing in about $35 to $40 million a year in revenue. No one in either case said, you know what, by 2024, we're going to see $100 million a year per school per year in television revenue. And the reason why that number keeps growing is twofold. One, there are so few bankable things in television right now in terms of getting live audience. And live audience is key. I mean, do you people, when you DVR things or when you watch things on TV, are you sitting there and voluntarily watching the commercials? I don't think so. Are you doing it during football games and basketball games? You probably are, because you can't really escape it at that point. Live sports, whether it's the NFL, whether it's college football, it has an appeal for advertisers because A, it's live, and B, it's a situation where you are going to constantly have people watching it that are really into the schools, really into what they're seeing. And you don't get that with other sorts of entertainment programming. So I don't think that you're going to see a situation where the numbers are going to go down. And if you want to continue to grow the pie, if you pick strategically who you want to bring into your conference, you put yourself in a position where, yes, you might have a short-term slight decrease in the amount of money that's being paid out. But if you're a Big Ten school, you're already going to go from 40 million to 100 million. I mean, if you go from 40 million to 90 million with the idea that if you add, say, Washington, who has the Seattle market, and Oregon, that's a national brand, or you add Notre Dame, who's a national brand, and you add North Carolina, who's a national brand, maybe not as much in football, but they're not hard done by there. The next time the media rights get negotiated, can you up it even more because you've got this more attractive suite of teams that you can now distribute on 5 tiers of media rather than 3 or 4 like it currently is. And that's going to be what I'm really interested in seeing, because ultimately I don't know what the solution is. I don't think the Big Ten is done, but I do think they're going to be judicious in what they decide to do. Now, the scenarios that I would say play out are as follows. You could see the Big Ten look at the Pac-12 and say, well, what are the most attractive remaining schools there? Who would we want to bring in? Who would really bring something to the table? Washington, to me, is the most logical next one because they are in a big market and they own that market. The one thing that might keep them from doing that is the Washington State legislature might be like, there's no way you're taking Washington without also taking Washington State. And the Big Ten will be like, bye, we're not doing that. Same thing with Oregon and Oregon State, because those are 2 pretty closely tied programs. You do have the other 2 California schools, and they both have some level of attraction. You know, Cal is not really a great brand right now, but, you know, them and Stanford combined are in the Bay Area, which is another huge market, 5th largest television market in the country. Stanford would be a tremendous feather in the cap of the Big Ten from an academic perspective. I mean, if you could add them, that is the dream of a lot of these presidents, to be able to partner with Stanford on a lot of things. So I would not rule that out. I think any other school in the Pac-12 is basically a non-starter. Like, you're not going to see Arizona is a non-entity. I mean, they really are. They're, like, football-wise, they're just not that important. And they don't have that big of a fan base. They don't really have a recruiting base. They bring very little to the table. Arizona State brings more to the table from a market perspective, but the problem is no one really cares about Arizona State athletics. I mean, you know, it's just an incidental thing. I mean, there's a small number of people that care about it, but it doesn't move the needle in recruiting. It doesn't move the needle in terms of revenue or media rights. And you know, you look at
that one friend of your one friend in the group who's just a complete party animal. Like, yeah, we got Arizona State though. Like, I mean, it does, joking aside, it does bring you the Phoenix market, which is a massively growing market. But you're right, it would be like having that one drunk friend. It's just like, yeah, they're fun to hang out with, but yeah, I don't want to do too many nights with them. So, like, they can't stay at my house.
So anyway, I think ultimately I would be if the Big Ten's going to add any more West Coast schools, and going back to the comment from earlier about does the big, do USC and UCLA, do they ask for that? I honestly think if you read closely the whole setup and the statements that have been made today, I would go read those closely, because something that pops up really, I think, prominently in the UCLA statement and the USC statement both is the idea that we are going to have more attractive start times for games. What was really irksome to both USC and UCLA, and really the whole Pac-12, but I think those programs especially, was that they were stuck playing in the 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock Eastern time window, and they don't want that. And I think they're perfectly fine with playing a noon game on the Pacific coast, or a 3:30 game in the Pacific time zone, even a 7 o'clock, or maybe not a 7 o'clock game, but a 3:30 game. I mean, that's a prime time game in the Eastern time zone. That's, I think, ultimately what they're after. And I think that they would be willing to trade not having a travel partner or two on the West Coast in exchange for having better kick times for football games in particular. So that might negate the need to bring in schools that don't bring a whole lot to the table from a financial perspective. So it'll be interesting to see. The second thing, and the big one, and Jennifer mentioned it earlier, is Notre Dame. Adam Rittenberg had an interesting anonymous quote from a source basically saying, from the Notre Dame perspective,
they can't be independent anymore.
It's becoming untenable to be an independent, and that's absolutely right. And
their deal with NBC is going to bring them less than like what Indiana will get from a Big Ten TV deal product setup. Then I'll jump in real quick before you get to the Notre Dame thing. Like, I'm interested in your thoughts on it, because on one hand, like when you look, I'm looking at a map right now of the new Big Ten layout, there's a pocket where it's like Indiana, Purdue, Illinois, Northwestern, Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State. If you add Notre Dame in there, it's just like, it's more people. You're continuing to like put this, this core density of schools in one area. On the flip side, something you said a couple times, I've heard this in other podcasts when talking about realignment, that, you've mentioned the word brands. And, when you look at it, when you're selling this to TV partners, like you look at what Disney has done, they're buying brands. Like they got Marvel, they got, Star Wars. Like they're just buying bankable brands that they can then sell and build off of. And, I think that's what Apple likes, is that, USC and UCLA are brands. Like they really are. And this is where, from a geographic perspective, Notre Dame does nothing. But from a brand perspective, they are probably the last good brand out there that you can grab. And so that's where I think it's very, very interesting. I also, again, looking at it from a kind of a three-dimensional chess piece, you kind of don't want them sitting out there, because, again, if the SEC grabs them, now suddenly the SEC has gotten into enemy territory where, they now have a team in your territory where you don't have a team in their territory. So it's almost like you got to grab them before the SEC does. But I look at this very much like a brand thing, where it's like Disney gets brands so they can bank and sell them. And I think that's how the Big Ten would sell this. And that's where I think Notre Dame makes a lot of sense in that respect, even though they don't do much geographically. But I also know they have a weird contractual thing with the ACC till like 2036. So it's like, how do you break that, even though everything seems to be able to be broken? So go ahead.
This is why lawyers exist. I mean, seriously. Like, yes, they have a grant of right.
This is what the Big Ten spends their money on. Like, hey, here's $20 million. Make that go away.
I mean, they have a grant of rights. And look, I think this is where ultimately the ACC, this is the fascinating thing to me is this. Like, the ACC went and hired Jim Phillips, who lost out on the Big Ten commissioner's job. And they hired him specifically to try to sort this out, because they've seen the train coming for a while. Like, they are at, like, all those schools are at a tremendous financial disadvantage that's growing exponentially, and they don't really have a good recourse. Now, I don't think that Jim Phillips can renegotiate that television deal without all of the schools saying we're totally in. That grant of rights, as was pointed out earlier, is binding, but it's only binding if you're in a competitive environment. And this is ultimately where I think the ACC is eventually not going to be able to handle things, because I have a hard time believing that these schools are going to allow themselves to be led down a path where they are going to be put at severe financial disadvantages for any more than a couple of seasons. And whatever the conference's, rights might say, I think you're going to see a situation where somehow they're going to find a way out of it. What is that way? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but I do think that it's important to keep in mind that you're talking about some pretty big brands, and you're talking about schools with a lot of pride who are looking around and watching schools that they feel that they are at the very least equal to, if not superior, getting 5 times the money on a yearly basis. I don't think that's going to stand. So whatever the mechanism is, I don't think that it's helpful to just cut off the discussion at this point and say, well, the ACC has this grant of rights that runs literally another 14 years, and therefore we can't have the discussion. So I'm just going to say we're going to live in fantasy land for a little bit, and we're going to say that somehow there's going to be a way that if a team wanted to, they could be dislodged from the ACC. That's going to be the big question mark. Notre Dame, obviously the one that makes the most sense. And I think, as Patrick said, Notre Dame's easy conference jump was the ACC, which is looking less and less appealing. This might be their last chance to make a move before they fall behind. With a new coach, now might be the time. I think the Notre Dame thing's fascinating because Notre Dame ultimately is the test case because they have the fewest actual ties to the ACC. They're not a full-fledged member in anything. Well, they're not in football, and that's the one that matters. And they can get out of all those other ties if they really want to. So what will that ultimately mean? They haven't joined the Big Ten for a variety of reasons. They haven't needed to financially because when they had that NBC deal, it paid them almost as much.
Yeah,
they pay them almost as much as what a Big Ten school was making when that started. Now it's not even close. And so if I'm Notre Dame, I'm staring irrelevance in the face unless I can figure out a way to put myself in a better position. And I think that
when does that NBC deal run out? I know it's a random question you may not know, but it's like when that ends, like that's kind of their end of the wall moment. Because if that ends, it's like, then do they get another deal like that? Or is it like, hey, we're just going to sign the Big Ten?
What's fascinating about this whole media rights bidding process for the Big Ten is one of the big bidders is NBC. And, Fox has driven the bus on so much of the media rights negotiations for the Big Ten because they are really joined at the hip. I mean, Fox, I think most of you know this, but Fox half owns the Big Ten network. Fox is the primary distributor. Fox made Big Noon Saturday the cornerstone, and the Big Ten is right smack dab in the middle of that. So, and as Ryan points out in the comments, the NBC deal ends in 2025, right around the time that you would be making some moves on this. So do we look at this and does NBC say, hey, we will move around what we're asking for if we can bring Notre Dame into this?
Now here's some of our lawyers, go figure it out.
Right. And now you've got one of Notre Dame's all-time traditional rivals in the Big Ten. And I'm not talking about Michigan. USC. I'm talking about USC. Yeah. And, suddenly now you start to see the pieces come together. The other important thing about all of this that I think is really fascinating is, Notre Dame, a lot of the resistance that Notre Dame's had to joining the Big Ten has been they haven't had to. And they were bitter about Michigan. And by the way, if anybody who ever wants to read the history of the Big Ten, by far the biggest assholes in Big Ten history are Michigan. And to some degree, they still are. But at this point, they're like a lot of that is water under the bridge. And so I look at Notre Dame and I say, well, we're going to have to let bygones be bygones on both sides, because at this point, both parties could use each other's help. The Big Ten doesn't need Notre Dame, but wow, that's a hell of a cherry to put on top of the sundae, to have a football conference that now has Ohio State, Penn State, USC, Notre Dame, Michigan, like just those 5 brands, from a fan base.
Don't forget Wisconsin, up and coming Michigan State.
From a fan base perspective, the 5 I listed, that is essentially coast to coast football. Yes, the SEC's got some really top level brands, but that sells on a national level in the way that perhaps, even Alabama, Texas doesn't necessarily do to quite the same volume. It's at least competitive at that point. Now, so the third scenario, because Notre Dame's kind of its own case study. Yeah. The third scenario that I think is worth investigating is the rest of the ACC. Is the ACC going to try to stick together? Would they try to partner with the remaining Pac-12 schools and form some kind of super conference? I think that would be suicidal, because at the end of the day, I don't think that conference works. Like I when you look at that, I'm like, that's not really attractive, because there's not
Oregon State, NC State this Saturday.
As much as people are joking about Rutgers USC is more compelling than what you just said. Now this is going to be a fascinating thing to watch, because when the last round of realignment was going, there were a lot of rumors that North Carolina was very interested in joining the Big Ten. And this is, you've heard about Virginia as a possibility because they've looked at what Maryland is doing from a financial perspective. I think both those schools, North Carolina and Virginia, they look at Maryland and they're like, that was
Maryland's
like
driving a Tesla. You got a new Tesla again?
That was the family living, in essentially the ACC double wide, and now they're pulling in literally double the money that North Carolina and Virginia are. I mean, there's a sting there from a reputational perspective that is hard to shake. And if you're the Big Ten and you look at that and you say, you know what? We would love to cut the heart out of the ACC, because North Carolina is essentially the heart of the ACC. I mean, if you go back and look at ACC history, they are essentially the straw that stirs the drink. And they are obviously a great basketball brand, and they're a good enough football brand that they can at least be somebody that makes a contribution. Virginia is more of an academic acquisition, but ultimately they just won a national title in basketball. They can contribute things athletically as well. I've heard people mention Duke. Duke doesn't really bring anything on the football side, but it does bring academics and basketball. So there's a lot of.
This is an idea I think that you've brought up before, but the problem is I think the Big Ten ends at 20. Like, I think the number you go for is 20. So if you're looking at you brought this idea, I think, on your podcast a year ago, that like one way to dislodge Notre Dame is you just kill the ACC. So you get UNC, maybe you get two teams, you get UNC and Virginia. The problem is if you dislodge them and then it's like the ACC is floundering, they can't afford to, because in the end too, it's like someone has to lawyer up and you got to pay for those lawyers. If Notre Dame's like, we're out, and then they can't, they're a fledgling conference. But if you take two ACC schools and then you also get Notre Dame, now you got to pick between Washington and Oregon. And so it's like, because I don't think 21 is the right number. 20 feels like the right number. 22 feels like it might be too big. So it does just pulling North Carolina do enough to destroy the ACC to then kind of dislodge Notre Dame, where you still have the two spots for Washington and Oregon?
I need to, there's a couple of great comments we've got coming in, but we've got one specifically that addresses the thing that you just mentioned, which is from Brian Tonsoni, Coach Tonsoni from Assembly Call. Is there a saturation point with number of teams in a conference, or is more always going to be better? So I think there's two separate answers. It's a great question. And a lot of people have been like, teams aren't even going to play each other. Patrick's been screaming about getting pods in the conferences, which I'm in favor of. We should definitely get some pods. But here's what I would say. There's two things that you have to consider if you're the Big Ten and the SEC. And one of them is the financial piece that we've already discussed. It's like, how big does the pie piece have to be attractive to all of the members? And if it shrinks below a certain point, where's the diminishing returns?
Yeah.
So now, I think the argument to be made in favor of continued expansion, at least to some degree, is that if you're adding pieces that will either in the moment or within the next 10 years increase the overall size of the pie proportionally, then I think you're doing something right. I mean, if you went back and said, yeah, the Big Ten's going to add Nebraska and they're going to do absolutely nothing for a decade and a half, and they're going to add Rutgers, who's going to do basically nothing for a decade, and they're going to add Maryland, who's not going to add much, well, that's going to shrink the pie. That's going to make the Big Ten less attractive. Well, guess what? It did none of those things. Then the Big Ten has now essentially increased their television revenue by a factor of 10 since Nebraska joined the league. So I do think that to some degree, the arguments against adding teams because it's going to shrink the revenue is less valid. And so you have to keep that in mind. But the other thing, and I think the more important one to Coach's question, is ultimately these aren't conferences the same way that we grew up with conferences in the 70s and 80s and 90s. These are brand collections. It's like, when Yum Brands sponsors the Kentucky Derby and they have to feature like KFC and Taco Bell and all of these
Pepsi,
and Pepsi in the ad. Like it's a suite of brands and marks and logos and fan bases that comprise essentially a portfolio of businesses. And I would not get hung up on, I'd say what I'd love to see, honestly, would be a 20-team conference that was split into 4 5-team sub-leagues that played a little playoff at the end that eventually sent a team to play in the national championship game in football. I think ultimately what you're doing as a conference is operating as a business entity that is trying to put the best portfolio of brands together to go to media partners or to use yourself in the Big Ten Network's case and go out and talk to advertisers directly and say, we have a portfolio of entertainment product of brands that you are going to want to spend a lot of money on because it's going to deliver the audience that you are desperate to get to. And that, to me, is the more important thing. Now, does there come a point where adding teams becomes less attractive? Like adding, who should I pick on here? Adding Texas Tech, and nothing against Texas Tech, but adding Texas Tech, if you're a conference like the Big Ten or the SEC, does nothing for your brand portfolio. And yes, it's probably not fair that Texas Tech is on the outside and say a Rutgers or an Indiana is on the inside, but there are winners and losers in life. And these are the sorts of things that happen sometimes, when the music stops, somebody's left without a chair. And in this case, it's Texas Tech or it's Kansas or somebody like that. But I do think that there is a balance that you strike, and it changes over time. Like 10 years ago, I don't think this move makes sense for USC and UCLA, and it doesn't make sense for the Big Ten. Today, it makes perfect sense for both, and that's because the business changes. And that ultimately is what you have to think about when you think about this, in my opinion, is this idea that you can't stand pat, you have to reevaluate. But I do think that as you add, there will come a point where it's like, I don't think we want to add that school or that school because they don't do much for the brand portfolio. And so that's how I would think about it. And I think that's how the conferences ultimately are thinking about it as well. We had a question from Patrick. Can NBC afford not to hang with these streaming services with Peacock and the streaming infrastructure already in place? It could really hammer home that platform. This is really the key piece. And this is where the news that Apple decided that they were going to get back in to the bidding rights on the Big Ten thing is really important, because it is a multipolar media world right now, because it is all the terrestrial television networks, ESPN, CBS, NBC, and then you've got kind of like your FS1s, you've got Big Fox, you've got the little Foxes, but then you've also got all these streaming services, some of which are tied to the platforms, Peacock with NBC, CBS All Access or whatever they're calling their thing now. Obviously ESPN Plus, which is a huge part of their platform. If you look at what ESPN Plus has done, they have really fully integrated a lot of the Olympic sports or non-revenue sports into the ESPN Plus platform where you can get them. I'd love to see Fox do that with like Big Ten Network Plus and some of the other things, because I think I'd love to see that become much more visible. And I think Patrick's point is really good. If I'm NBC and I'm left holding a bag and the only thing that's in the bag is like Notre Dame, and I don't even have the rights to Notre Dame's non-revenue sports because all that's with the ACC network, which is a subsidiary of ESPN, I'm like, I don't like what I'm doing here. But being able to leverage Peacock and the streaming on that, and we know Peacock very well, Scott, because we're both IndyCar fans.
Yep.
Being able to have more programming that's pertinent to sports fans that aren't just Premier League fans and IndyCar fans is going to be really important for that streaming service to continue to grow, because ultimately you got to have content that people want to watch. And college football is about the second or third best thing that you can have overall in the US right now, as far as that sort of content is concerned with sports.
So this is something that I'm fascinated by is the streaming services. Like I love the business of Netflix and Apple TV and Disney. And I do think my 2 cents here are going to be, I'm not going to have an answer, but I think you're in this world where you have, I'm seeing this here from Adam, the $2.5 billion for Apple TV and MLS deal. What's interesting is at some point I keep thinking like that, Amazon, Apple TV, Netflix, like they're going to get into sports because it's kind of the last thing that has, the kind of pull. On the flip side, I will say this, that when you look at every deal, Netflix, Disney, Apple, when they make deals for media rights, sports are like the thing they hate to do, because when you buy the NBA rights, like Disney, like I said, they bought Marvel, they have Marvel forever. Like they can now show Marvel movies for all of time. if you buy the NBA rights, you don't get it forever. You buy the Big Ten rights, you get it for 10 years. And normally those companies don't like to then suddenly have to pull stuff off their service. Like Netflix, Disney, all of them, they like collecting. And now it's like, now we are the home for every Star Wars movie ever. Disney's not in the business of 10 years from now saying, oh, Star Wars is now on Netflix. Sorry. Like they want to build a universe where they have a tab, they can sell, rides for it. And so they don't want to build a, Big Ten football theme park. And then 10 years from now, they don't have the rights. So I do wonder if those streaming services are ever going to get into sports in a full way, because it's just kind of atypical of what their business model is. Yeah. That said, the NBA is coming due, I think, in 2025. The Big Ten's kind of in the same spot. Like the Big Ten is in a nice spot where they're one of the last big properties that's going to be available until the next cycle. And so I think NBC's in a unique spot because they have a nice streamer. But I think it's going to be, it would be very atypical for like Apple say, we're going to buy the whole rights and we're going to own it, because it's just, it's not what they've normally done, because they like to own properties forever. But
I'm going to pull up that comment from Adam Cabe. Apple just committed $2.5 billion over 10 years to MLS. Now they got an exclusive deal and MLS is doing the production or paying for the production, but still that's a lot of money. I mean, that's about what we're looking at potentially, that the Big Ten might be able to pull if they play their cards really right. Maybe not $2.5 billion, but we're certainly talking in the billions of dollars. Now, the problem for a lot of people, and I will include myself.
I will say too, like Apple does have, like, just quick Google. I mean, they're sitting on $200 billion in just cash. The revenue they make. I mean, that's a 2-month period of revenue for them. Like it is. You talk about staggering money. Apple.
It's a rounding error for Apple to spend that much money. Yeah.
I will. The last thing I'll say to this is, like, it is much more in the realm of these companies. I know it's not possible, but just, these companies don't think in terms of let's buy the rights for the NBA. They're much more like, let's just buy the NBA. Like that's kind of where these companies are. And I'm not saying it's obviously not possible in college athletics, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a more out of the box, view of Apple versus just being like, we're going to pay $4 billion.
So, this is interesting to me. I mean, ultimately, I don't know what direction it goes. I mean, even the grant of rights thing with the ACC, there was an interesting story last year about Clemson potentially joining the SEC, and everybody points back to that grant of rights thing. But ultimately, if the ACC folds on its own, especially if ESPN's involved, then the grant of rights is gone. And even if the grant of rights sticks around, all that happens is that the television revenue that you would have earned in the conference stays in the conference. Well, if I'm only earning $20 million a year and I'm a Florida State or a Miami or a North Carolina, and I have the potential to make $100 million a year, I mean, okay, great. I'm only making $80 million a year for the next couple of years, or what? Yeah, it's better than it may not even be that. It may just be, okay, well, I'm going to forfeit the $20 million, but I'm making an extra $80 million on top of that because I've gone ahead and left. Again, we got to get lawyers involved in this, and it's my fault for not inviting a lawyer to the podcast. We'll do that next time.
This is also where the media rights. This is where an NBC or an Apple could say, we'll pay that. Like we'll eat the $20 million of that grant of rights, and so we'll just pay it off.
Yeah. So anyway, the last thing I'll say on this, then this is where I think it really gets interesting. If you're the Big Ten, you might look at this and you might say, okay, if that's the case, if we've got the money backing, if we can buy out the grant of rights, do you try? I mean, the academic part of the Big Ten is tough because, you want AAU schools in most cases. You want schools that really have a high academic profile, but you also want market share. You also want to be able to get into marketplaces. So do you look at it and you say, you know what? We're going to grab Miami, which is a pretty good academic school, because that brings a great football brand and another huge market to our conference. Now, granted, Miami hasn't been great lately. But you're probably not going to bring a Florida State in because I don't think they match the academic profile. But if you could grab a Florida State, or if you could grab a Clemson and keep that school from joining the SEC, now suddenly you put the whole thing into an entirely different category, because now you're competing on the SEC's turf for their players, for their.
Well, that goes back to why I don't
recruits.
think you can't let the SEC get Notre Dame.
Yeah, that will absolutely. Well, and that's the thing. I don't think the Notre Dame would ever join the SEC. I like that. That makes as little sense culturally as as anything in college sports. Like Virginia Tech in the ACC is a weird match because that is not really an ACC fan base. Notre Dame in the SEC would be like a completely unmatched group, right?
You mentioned the Notre Dame USC. You're also bringing this world that I love. If you get Notre Dame in Miami and you can bring back Catholics and convicts, like you have so many great fun rivalries you can bring back.
Anyway, so we don't know where it's going, but I do think the Big Ten.
What do you think the time? I'll ask this. Like we've talked to schools a lot. If you see the Big Ten continuing to expand, or we haven't mentioned who you think the SEC would go after, was one of my questions. I'm curious who you think on the SEC, and then what do you see as a timeline of this happening? Do you see it happening in the next 12 to 24 months? But yeah, I'm also curious, who do you think the SEC might go after?
Well, okay, so I don't think there will be movement. I don't know the movement will be immediate, but it kind of depends. And this is the big uncertain factor for me on this. Like if I'm looking at this forward, like the Big Ten is going to be wrapping up its media negotiations at some point, and I think they would like to know Notre Dame. Are you coming with us? If so, let's put that on the table, because guess what? That means more money for you, and it means more money for us. You grow the pie that way. Now, you probably don't need to hurry it at this point, but you do need to factor that into the negotiations, and that needs to be a thing. And it's like, look, if you're going to do this, we need to know, because we got to work out the contractual elements, and that is going to be fascinating to me to see how it all goes. The big other item here is ESPN, and actually Ryan just brought this up. The SEC and the ACC are both essentially partnered primarily with ESPN. What's fascinating to me about this whole thing is that ESPN was the reason why we didn't get the 4 super conferences back in the last round of things, because they didn't want there to be that much consolidation. They wanted to be able to, to bid things down a little bit. So they got in the middle of things, and they kept Texas from leaving for the Pac-12. But they also did that because the Pac-12 is a Fox property, and the Big Ten is a Fox property. And so you've got this proxy war happening between ESPN, which has the SEC and the ACC and the Big 12, and you've got the Fox, which has the Big Ten now, and the remnants of the Pac-12. And so I'm curious to see how that goes, because ultimately, I think a lot of these schools, if you're smart, if you're a Notre Dame, if you're a Clemson, if you're a North Carolina, if you're a Miami, you're saying, what can you do for us? Like, what can you provide us? And, the SEC just went through adding 2 new schools. And yes, Texas and Oklahoma both added something to the pie. But with that, the SEC just kind of got up to where the Big Ten was from a financial perspective, maybe slightly ahead. If I'm in that and I'm like, okay, if I'm Miami, or if I'm Florida State, or if I'm North Carolina, am I going to join the SEC where suddenly I'm like the 8th or 9th or 10th most important brand in football? Or do I want to join the Big Ten where I'm going to be higher up in the echelon and maybe make more money and have more flexibility, because I'm not in a conference that's cannibalizing its schedule and, is already committed. The one nice thing about being a coast-to-coast conference is you've got a much larger television window to put games on it. Yeah. And so, unlike, all the SEC schools are in
to 10.
They're in a window, and there's only so many primetime slots that really work. And the
Big Ten can have 4 primetime games every Saturday.
Yeah. So that's going to be the big thing to watch for me is how does all that play out? And I don't know the answer, but it's a lot of fun to talk about. And we've already done an hour and a half on this. I think we're going to call time on it. But I would encourage you all to stick around. I'm going to, as I mentioned, be doing at least one more podcast, probably 2 on this over the weekend. We've got some special guests to bring in, get their perspective on things. I really appreciate everybody tuning in on very short notice to talk with us about this. Some great comments.
What are your thoughts on possibly getting more Bill Walton in your life now?
I love it. Give me all the Bill Walton. Like Bill Walton doing a mid-February game in Bloomington. I can't wait to hear him complaining. Oh, I was riding my bicycle and it's like 5 degrees outside. I can't wait. Just the content will be amazing. But no, I guess to summarize my thoughts on this, I mean, I get, again, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, I get why people are unhappy because what they are used to in college sports has rapidly disappeared. And I'd love to tell you that was somehow an illusion or that we're going to go back to the good old days, and it's just not. And right now, it's one of those situations where the Big Ten and Indiana are in a much better position today than they were yesterday, because now you've added 2 schools in a major media market that have tremendous cachet. That's going to put you in a financial position where you're going to be able to sustain and maybe even improve in certain areas. And it's going to create some tremendous games, some tremendous matchups. It's going to create a whole new era of college sports. It's going to look different than the last era of college sports. And I know that's going to be disappointing to some people, but if, as you mentioned, you can either be part of the haves or the have-nots. And, I use part of the haves right now, and that's nice to see. And there's a lot of cool and interesting and probably peculiar things that are going to happen as things shift over the next few years, some of which that we can't predict right now. But I'm fascinated, at least from my perspective, to watch all of it take place and see how it all shakes out.
Yeah. I mean, I will reiterate what I said. This is a good thing, and you're in a spot where you need to be growing or you're going to be picked apart. And it's really good. Steve Bardo. But no, it's really good that we are part of a growing conference, and it looks like there's going to be 2 winning conferences as the way this works out, and we're part of one of them. And it's really good luck that we're not just the kind of the last one in. Like, we're one of the founding members, so we can make fun of Maryland and we can make fun of Rutgers. Like, we're one of the OGs of the Big Ten. And if you get Notre Dame, it's like Indiana, the state, is the center of the Big Ten conference. We would have three of the schools would be there, and tangentially Northwestern and Illinois are really close. And not to mention, I think
not just the crossroads of America, the crossroads of the Big Ten.
Yeah, still bring back the Crossroad Classic. But it's hey, I love the idea of Indiana playing at Pauley and UCLA coming here. Seeing those things happen. Indiana playing USC in football. This is all good stuff. And again, the thing that the money just can't be understated, and the fact that it puts us ahead of everyone else and we just keep growing it is good. But no, I'm excited, and I hope that I'm very curious to see who makes the next move. Like, it'll happen at some point, but is it the Big Ten or is it the SEC? But I will say now I feel very good that we are in steady hands, because I was very worried the Big Ten was just going to stand pat and be like, we did the right thing. But you have to give the Big Ten credit for a lot of things over the last 25 years that, you mentioned the history of things, but they were very forward thinking in getting their own network. So yeah, very fair point there on the Twitter. But they were the one to push this forward with a network. And at the time, everyone's like, what are you going to play on the Big Ten network? Well, that changed the paradigm for everything. And then suddenly all the other conferences were fighting to get their own network up and running. The Big Ten was first. They expanded into everyone. The Rutgers thing is funny, but it's like they were looking at markets really before other conferences were looking at markets. It's like, we're going to unlock New York to help our TV market. And as you said, the money only got better as they added schools. They added Nebraska, which again is kind of we're going to get a brand in the Big Ten. And they've been very forward thinking. And, the SEC made their move. I would say that our move of getting USC and UCLA was just a better move. It looks better, and it feels more like we're getting 2 brands who want to be with us, where it almost feels like Texas and Oklahoma are kind of, sorry for the metaphor, but kind of like bucking horses you're bringing in that are kind of like, you got to really hold on to these guys. Like, do they really want to be here? Or are they bucking around? Like, this feels way more synergetic. So it just all along the way, it's like, it does feel like we are in good hands. And while I felt like maybe they were being too passive, they've been on the front of the curve the whole time. So I feel like the next moves they make, we have to give them credit. They're doing the right thing. So I'm super happy.
We'll talk more about this as we move forward. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. Thanks to Scott for hopping on short notice. It's always fun to talk about these things with you. And thanks to everybody for all your comments on Twitter, on YouTube during this whole podcast. Our thanks to Home Field Apparel, who, of course, is our title sponsor and has more vintage stuff that they'll be throwing.
New Big Ten shirts, new logo.
Looking forward to that. As I joked on the last podcast, I'm looking forward to the collection of defunct conference logo shirts.
Oh, yes.
Like the first time I can buy like a vintage Pac-12 shirt logo.
Too soon. RIP, too soon.
Just amazing. Anyway, thanks to all you folks for joining us. And we'll be back later on in the week with some more podcasts on this particular topic. And we'll be back in July with IU football as it's getting ready to go. We'll talk some IU basketball as well. So thanks again for joining us, everybody. For Scott over there, I'm Galen. This is CrimsonCast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Be sure to tune into Assembly Call as they had plenty to say on Assembly Call Radio tonight. Be sure to listen into that episode as well. So anyway, catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison and welcome to Los Angeles, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good one.